Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. One of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
Hey, it's Austin James. If you're like me, trying to live your best life while living with diabetes, you can relate to worrying if you're doing a good job managing your diabetes. I use the Freestyle Libre 3 Plus sensor to get real-time glucose readings and see the impact of every meal and activity to make better decisions. The Freestyle Libre 3 Plus sensor can help me live life with diabetes on my own terms, and it gives me more time for the things I love, like being a dad and a musician. Now this is progress. Learn more at freestylelibre.us.
For prescription only. Safety info found at freestylelibre.us.
Hey everyone, it's Kavitha Davidson and welcome back to Sportly. As we're wrapping up this year of 2024, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the past few months of hosting Sportly and this year in sports. The highs and the lows, the challenges, and kind of everything in between. And we'll also take a look back at some of the biggest stories in sports this year and what they tell us about where we're headed into the new year. If you've listened to this podcast or you just know me at all, I'm a native New Yorker, so I'm going to start out on a high note. I'm going to start with the New York Liberty winning the WNBA championship this year.
The original franchise has its very first title.
Congratulations, 2024 champion.
On a personal level, obviously, it was a fantastic thing to see. As a city, we've kind of been starved for a championship. It was the Liberty's first championship in their long and storied history, and it was done on the back of Jonquel Jones, who earned that finals MVP. And it was really also done in the context of a year in which interest in the W reached record highs, and that was as much a function as, of course, Caitlin Clark entering the league, but also just years and years of sustained growth and marketing and programming, honestly, having these wonderful athletes in these games available on channels like ABC and ESPN and being able to watch them anywhere. And this is kind of anecdotal, but I go into my local bar or I go into any bar in New York City and ESPN is on. And if ESPN has a WNBA game on, people are watching it and they're realizing how good a product it is and how fun a form of basketball this is. If you really love fundamental post-play basketball, we don't have that in the NBA so much anymore, but we very much have that in the W. And it's really been fantastic to see. I was at the Liberty Championship Parade down at City Hall, and the vibes were immaculate. The crowds were incredible, and everybody was just in the most celebratory mood on a really beautiful day in October. So lots of things to be thankful for, to be grateful for as Liberty fans, as fans of women's basketball, and just as fans of sports in general. It was a year of redemption in a lot of ways for the Liberty, to be honest. This was a team that made it all the way to the finals last year, only to lose to the Las Vegas Aces. And the road to redemption was long and hard fought. The Liberty had the best regular season record in the league this year, and we kind of know that that doesn't always signal a championship, but in this case, the best team, at least on paper, absolutely won. The Liberty entered the playoffs as the top seed with the best record in the league and hosted the Atlanta Dream in the first round. I was lucky to be at quite a few of those games, and home court advantage really pulled through there. The Liberty swept the Dream 2-0, and then went on to face the formidable Aces, the team that bumped them in the finals last year. That was also, a contentious series, and the Liberty ended up taking that series in 4 games and then faced Minnesota. And then in the finals, this this heated rematch of the Commissioner's Cup final that happened earlier in the season between the Liberty and the Minnesota Lynx. And this one went the distance. We had some really incredible games. We had obviously some late game heroics by Sabrina Ionescu, just making huge shots.
Bustling through, looking for an angle, able to whirl it in. Heck of a finish from Sabrina Ionescu.
And also just passing the ball. I think that that's a part of her game that goes really not talked about enough. And we saw that in the Olympics. But it was a fantastic 5-game series. And the Liberty ultimately emerged victorious and were able to hoist that cup for the first time in franchise history. And I'm thinking of a conversation that I had earlier with Jessica Luther on this podcast. Jessica and I have been women's basketball fans and W fans just forever. I guess you could say before it was fashionable.
Men's sports are an exclusionary space, and they were built that way. And one of the things that I want to happen so much more in women's sports is I want people to dream bigger, think bigger than what men's sports has offered. And you're right, we're in the beginning of a lot of things. And
one of the things that I think a lot of us have reflected on as more people are coming into this game and as more people are realizing just how great the basketball is, not a lot of that has changed. This level of play has always been there. The interest was not sustained from a marketing perspective. And now we're seeing all of that turn around. And that's a great thing to see. And I get asked this question whenever I go on other podcasts or television a lot, which is this moment sustainable? And I understand why the question comes, but it shouldn't even just be a question at this point. This isn't a moment. 2024 certainly was not an anomaly. Again, if you go back and you look at ratings growth, if you look at attendance growth, if you look at the sponsorship deals and all of that, it's all been building to this point and the future. And we're going to continue to see that. Now, there are obviously going to be some major hurdles going forward. One is that, with all of this huge new interest and huge influx in money, especially with the new TV deal that the NBA and the WNBA just struck earlier this year.
According to reports, the NBA and network executives finalized contracts that will make Amazon Prime and NBC new partners while keeping ESPN as the home of the NBA Finals.
There are some contract negotiations and some collective bargaining negotiations that are going to happen. Right after the finals, the union opted out of its CBA, of its collective bargaining agreement, and will enter those negotiations heading into next year. And a big part of that is going to be increased pay for their players, which was a huge talking point when people realized just how little these women are getting paid compared to, not just compared to their male counterparts, but just compared to how much money the league is now bringing in.
In 2023, a WNBA player earned on average base salary of almost $114,000. An NBA player made an average base salary of $9.7 million. That's a huge pay disparity. It has been
and various aspects of labor protections, workplace protections. We've seen a couple of lawsuits this year that really put a damper on the celebratory mood in the WNBA, particularly Derica Hamby had a lawsuit against the Aces saying that she was discriminated against because she got pregnant, was not treated the same because she was going to have to take maternity leave. So there are some growing pains in this league. I like to remind people that this league is less than 30 years old. Again, unprecedented growth that we've seen with the W. And I think the hope is that these negotiations go relatively smoothly as any kind of labor negotiation can go, and that players do get a more fair proportion and piece of the pie because they are what we all go and pay to see.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, onabotulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Future you faces some big expectations. Work out more, go to bed earlier, and most importantly, make smart money decisions. Thankfully, today you has Bank of America. One place with tools and guidance to help balance tasks from budgeting to saving, so you can just be you. With big plans, do more with a bank that asks, what would you like the power to do? Explore our tips and more at bankofamerica.com/futureyou.
We will obviously be talking about Caitlin Clark in this episode, but for now I wanted to, kind of go through some of the interesting things that we're seeing in college. As of this taping, Bill Belichick, legendary, perhaps one of the greatest NFL coaches we've ever seen, has agreed to go coach football at UNC.
North Carolina offered him the certainty of a job coaching that the NFL didn't. The NFL had a chance to hire Bill Belichick.
And it's puzzling a lot of people why he would jump into this kind of really messy college sports landscape that we have right now. And one of the reasons that it is this messy is because of some strides that college athletes have made with NIL rights, name, image, and likeness rights, and with a landmark antitrust settlement that has been starting to pay out. These are two separate things, and I want to make that clear, that college athletes being paid in some way is not the same as this antitrust settlement that includes back pay for the athletes who did not get to benefit from NIL rights. But a lot of people are upset at how this is playing out in college. And one of the reasons is that, some of their favorite players are entering the transfer portal, which a lot of people believe is broken in the way that it's being used right now. So they're leaving their favorite teams or their favorite schools, either because they're not getting the kind of sponsorship or NIL deals that they could get elsewhere, or because they want more playing time. And I do understand that it's messy, but I think if you've been following the NCAA in the last several decades, a lot of people believe that the NCAA has been broken for a really long time, and that the system under which college athletes were not being compensated, especially in revenue generating sports like football and men's basketball, and in some cases women's basketball, that it was unfair. And some people in front of Congress have likened it to a cartel system. So all of this is a pendulum shift to try and correct some of those wrongs. But also, it's all indicative of a way in which the NCAA is kind of fighting for survival instead of having the entire system being blown up. So what we're going to continue to see is how schools start to manage some of these settlements, especially from a financial standpoint, how, the burgeoning business of being a college athlete continues to grow. And one of the biggest questions heading into 2025 is if and or when college athletes will be allowed to unionize.
Last month, the Dartmouth men's basketball team voted 13-2 to form a union after the National Labor Relations Board ruled that the players were employees of the private university.
There have been several cases in front of the NLRB toward the end of college athletes unionizing. The Dartmouth men's basketball team was deemed employees by the courts, which paves the way for them to unionize and for other programs and other teams. That will be interesting to see, but we're going into bowl season, and these will all be questions that keep arising. And, fans obviously are very, very split on this. I think that one of the more interesting things that we've seen, the shifts that we've seen from 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, is that the majority of the American public, I think, now realizes that college athletes deserve to be compensated in some form or fashion. Whether that is direct pay to play is where the split lies. But 5-10 years ago, we mostly couldn't agree on that aspect. So I think that that's positive as far as public sentiment goes, that, in the last several years, people have come to realize just how big a business this is, and that the kind of amateur ideal that the NCAA always used to tout was really just a lot of talk. And if you're buying a jersey with a player's number on the back, then maybe that player deserves a cut of some of this money that is in a lot of cases going to very high multi-million-dollar salaries for coaches and assistant coaches and coordinators and athletic directors in some cases, and now starting to go to the players themselves.
In an historic first, the NCAA and nation's Power 5 conferences have reached a deal to pay their athletes. The ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, SEC, and Pac-12 accepted the general terms of a settlement that will see the NCAA pay nearly $2.8 billion in damages over 10 years to nearly 14,000 athletes dating from 2016 to now. It also creates a new system that allows schools to use up to $21 million a year to pay student athletes in any sport starting in 2025.
The form that they're going to players is also up for debate. There are local businesses that are paying them, that are paying certain players for sponsorship deals. Then there are booster collectives. And I think that this is where a lot of people start to have some issues, which then you have, wealthy alumni of each school raising money. And, it's as close to a direct pay for play situation without having the university directly issue these payments. But if we're being particularly honest with ourselves, this has kind of always been done. It was never formalized in this way, and it was always done a little bit under the table. So I'm much more in favor of these kinds of things being brought above ground, and then you can monitor and regulate, and then hopefully these athletes don't get taken advantage of anymore. But the unionization question will be really interesting to see going forward, and how, as athletes start to have more say in college because of the money, they also have more freedom of movement. And we've seen that a lot in professional sports. And we're going to see that, if we haven't already, mirror that in college sports. The dirty little secret when it comes to college sports is that, especially for sports like football and basketball, college kind of provides a free minor league system for the NFL and the NBA and the W. And the NFL in particular really does benefit from this. They draft from college, and the expectation of going to the pros is one of the reasons that these players until now have been kind of okay with not being rightfully compensated. But the NFL and the NBA and the professional leagues do have to contend with the fact that they obviously benefit from quote unquote amateur athletes, and their success is built off of the labor that's being put in the lower ranks of college before these athletes get to the pros. So that's all part of this system and this ecosystem of sports that we'll continue to see shifting in the next coming years. Another thing that has been really difficult for me to witness, but I'm not surprised at all, is the continuing use of sports as a political cudgel. Now, I'll make a distinction between that and kind of gross pandering. We saw recently that a Republican congressman out of Ohio, has introduced legislation to ban opposing teams planting flags on home fields. And this came obviously after the big kerfuffle at Ohio State, Michigan, where a Michigan flag was planted on Ohio State's field, and it resulted in a lot of violence and brawls and, a lot of things that are already illegal, I would like to point out.
Right now, Michigan tried to plant their flag in the middle of the Ohio State field, and the Buckeyes rushed right to them.
But this particular congressman decided that it was a particularly good use of public resources to go through the motions of introducing this bill to ban flag planting. And as I tweeted at him, 400,000 children in the state of Ohio live with food insecurity. I just think that maybe we have some more important things to address in Congress and in government than something like this. But people have been using sports to pander to their base or to outside voters forever. That's never going to go away, and that's always been the case. But I think this year we've seen a continuation of sports particularly being used to divide us on political lines, on identity lines. And that's something that I think we need to call out whenever we see it, because it's damaging to us as a country, and it's also damaging to the subjects at hand.
When unprecedented times are all the time, it's time to start walking the talk with PwC. Leaders like you turn to PwC to see and stay ahead. Upskill your workforce, use intelligent automation, and transform big ideas into breakthrough outcomes. Explore the human-led, tech-powered solutions that help you thrive. It's all part of PwC. Learn more at pwc.com.
Obviously, a lot has been made about the issue of trans athletes and trans people participating in sports at all levels. And this has done, obviously, immense damage to the trans community, which has existed before this year and will continue to exist after it, and trans athletes who have been competing without really anybody saying anything until it became politically expedient to do so. And it's fair to have questions, and it's fair to have really honest conversations about fairness and biological advantage. But the level to which this conversation has dominated in certain political circles, I think deserves a mark of skepticism because, one, it really isn't as big of an issue as it's being made. It's getting outsized coverage. Trans athletes are not winning every championship. There was a state volleyball player who had been competing on her team for 2 years until she was outed this year.
Several teams have forfeited games against the Spartans after a lawsuit from a team captain who alleged that one of her teammates is transgender.
And teammates and fans and administrators had no problem with her until she was outed against her will. And she was, I think, ranked not even in the top 100 and maybe not even in the top 150 of individual stats. Her team didn't win a championship. She wasn't taking a spot away from somebody else who was more deserving. But this kind of thing dominated headlines. And I got a ton of media requests to talk about this. And I turned a lot of them down. One, because I think that we should always try and center trans and NB people when we're doing interviews on subjects like this. And I'm not a trans person, but also because I think the more that we talk in a really disingenuous way about the quote unquote debate around this, the more it does a disservice to all of us who care about sports, all of us who have loved ones who are trans, and to trans athletes and trans people in general who remain among the most vulnerable in our country and in our society. And then the part of this that really did grind my gears, even more so than all of the things I just mentioned, was all of the people coming out of the woodwork to disingenuously argue against trans athletes in the name of protecting women's sports. And as somebody who has been talking about and covering women's sports, both from an economic viability standpoint and from a fairness standpoint for more than a decade now, these are not people who have been part of this conversation before, quite frankly. The people who have come out to so fervently defend women's sports by excluding trans athletes are oftentimes the same people who have denigrated women's sports, who say nobody watches women's basketball, who say women's sports wouldn't be around without the men subsidizing them. And along those lines, we have to acknowledge that a lot of women athletes themselves have also come out against trans athletes. And I think that that's a really difficult part of this conversation, but we have to acknowledge that that exists. But with the growth of women's sports comes as much of the bad as the good. And I guess it's a march toward equality if women's sports are being used to score political points in the same way men's sports have, I guess, is where I'm landing on that. But in the realm of women's sports, we also saw the growth of the W and particularly the rise of Caitlin Clark being used as a political cudgel.
When Kennedy Carter hip-checked Caitlin, was that a basketball play? Absolutely not. Was Kennedy wrong? 100%. It was not.
You know, this was a conversation that unfortunately also dominated the back page. And instead of talking in a lot of cases about the fantastic basketball that we were seeing, or the Olympic gold medal winning squad extending their wild gold medal streak, or unprecedented growth and interest in all of that, we were talking about things like whether Caitlin Clark was being targeted on the court by mostly Black athletes was the narrative. And then these athletes themselves were being subjected to lines of questioning about whether or not they were physically targeting a player on the court. And everyone involved has obviously said that that's ridiculous. Caitlin Clark has said that many times, but has continued to be used, much to Caitlin Clark's own detriment, frankly, by people who are seeking to take advantage of that to further kind of divide us along racial lines or along lines of, whether women's sports were viable or legitimate before Caitlin Clark came along. And obviously, she is one of the greatest talents we have ever seen. She is the most prolific scorer in the history of college basketball, men's or women's. She has brought an incredible amount of popularity and interest into this league, an interest that existed outside of endemic fan bases. And that is something to be acknowledged. And yes, a lot of that is because she is white and marketable as being white. And she will say that. She hasn't said it a lot this year, but she was just named Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year. And in that interview, she said a lot that made some of her supporters a little bit angry. And I think it's really telling what some of her fans are mad about.
I grew up a fan of this league from a very young age. Like, my favorite player was Maya Moore. Like, I know what this league was about. And like I said, like, it's only been around 25 plus years. So I know there's been so many amazing Black women that have been in this league, and continuing to uplift them, I think, is very important. And that's something I'm very aware of.
She basically said, the W is a league that has mostly been built on the backs of Black women, which is true, that she came around at the right time and is contributing and benefiting from those who came before her. That is also absolutely true. She thinks it's ridiculous that people think the physicality of the game was targeting her because of her race. That is absolutely ridiculous. And it was really nice to see her, kind of answer some of those things from a very just like, I'm an athlete perspective. She basically said, I get poked in the eye all the time. As a basketball player. Many people do, men and women. And basically she said, we don't hear a lot of men being asked when they get a little injured or when they get a finger in their eye or when they get, hit on the court. We never really get men asked unless it's something egregious, whether or not that was on purpose. And she has been asked that about multiple plays throughout this season and has answered it. So people have been using Caitlin Clark as a way to kind of further this narrative. And a lot of this narrative is that, the WNBA is this league of scary Black women and scary gay women that was never making money until Caitlin Clark came along. And again, while we cannot discount the immense contributions she has made to this game on and off the court, it is simply not true that this league did not exist in its current form or in any kind of money generating form before Caitlin Clark.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
And, the last thing that happened that we should probably talk about a little bit is that it was an Olympics year. And as you probably know, I have written and talked a lot about how problematic the Olympics are and mega events in general. But something that Jessica and I did talk about on our episode together was, as problematic as the Olympics are, I love them so. They are fantastic.
There was phenomenal reporting by Dave Zirin and Jules Boykoff on the ground in Paris on all of the issues around like moving the unhoused and all the sort of environmental things that are in play. So really important work at the nation. It's good and important. And the Olympics as a entity are bad. The athletics of the Olympics are an absolute joy. And the athletes were amazing.
And this year might have been one of the greatest Olympics years that we have ever seen, between the Paris opening ceremony that, frankly, a lot of Americans, I think, just didn't get the cultural references. But between the introduction of new sports, between just the beauty of Paris as a host city, and again, American dominance in basketball and gymnastics. Simone Biles is is Simone Biles, and we can't really say very much more than that about her. It was really nice to see the Olympics bounce back, especially after COVID postponed the Tokyo Olympics. And a lot of people around the games, definitely around NBC, were really concerned about what the future of the Olympics might be. And if this year was any indication, the future of the Olympics is pretty solid. And we look forward to the Winter Olympics coming up in 2 years. Obviously, the Olympics also gave us some controversy from the hilarious, which was Ray Gunn, the Australian breaker, if we want to call her that, which really set off a whole conversation. And you can go back and listen to our breaking episode about kind of the history and the cultural importance of breaking as an art form being born out of poor communities and the hip hop community in the South Bronx among Latino and Black folks there. You know, the whole Ray Gun thing was hilarious, obviously, and a travesty, but also I think brought up some really interesting touch points of conversation about appropriation, about what happens when something that does derive from the culture of non-white people becomes mainstream and global and profitable, and someone with, shall we say, no flavor gets to take the cipher. But for the most part, I think that, you know, the introduction of breaking in the Olympics was pretty interesting. It was pretty great. And I've got friends who are breakers who hated the Ray Gun conversation because they felt that it distracted from a lot of what they have poured their blood, sweat, and tears into, and what this art form and this sport can be.
This morning, the International Olympic Committee announcing that American gymnast Jordan Childs must return a bronze medal she won in the women's floor exercise. The committee upholding the decision to void a scoring appeal made by Childs' coach to get her.
And then, of course, there was a lot of controversy in gymnastics with the Romanian gymnast and Jordan Childs and the bronze medal. And on the one hand, the IOC takes some steps forward, and on the other hand, they remind us that there's still the IOC, because I feel like a lot of this controversy could have just been avoided had there been electronic line judging, as we have in tennis and as we have in other sports. But at the end of the day, you know, it's what it is. And I don't think as a nation, you know, we come together to support Jordan, but it doesn't detract at all from what these women did for us and for their sport and for their country. That said, we've got some mega events coming up, and I think that we'll have some conversations in future episodes about mega events being problematic for some of the reasons that I just mentioned. Most recently, Saudi Arabia was granted the hosting rights to the 2034 World Cup. This wasn't a surprise. They were the only bidder. Similar to the World Cup in Qatar 2 years ago, there are numerous human rights concerns. There are numerous people, myself included, who are coming out and just wondering where FIFA is choosing to draw this line, if they are at all. And it doesn't seem as if they are. So those are going to be some things to look for in the next coming years. But, you know, we've got a World Cup coming up in 2 years in North America first. So I guess let's stay focused on that for the time being. So those were kind of the biggest stories that we saw on a global scale, at least in sports in 2024. You know, I haven't gotten into a number of other things. I will say personally, I had one of the best Octobers as a sports fan that I have had in recent memory, between the Liberty winning the WNBA championship and the Yankees making a deep run all the way to the World Series. Now, it was a disappointing series and the Yankees obviously didn't win. But, you know, October baseball is designed to break your heart. And at the end of the day, once I got over that disappointment and that sadness, I forgot what the stadium felt like in October. And it's the thing that initially drew me in. It's the reason I'm a sports fan. It is certainly the reason I made this a career. And the Bronx in October just hits different. And I'm lucky to have been at every single home game. I'm lucky to have been there with my Yankee crew. I'm lucky to be able to say that hopefully we'll be in the playoffs again next year, and we'll certainly have baseball next year. And that's kind of all that we can ask for. Also, on a personal level, it's been really exciting to, come at you each week in this podcast. This is a passion project for me. And, I'm able to cover some stories that I haven't covered elsewhere. I'm able to cover some stories that I have covered elsewhere, but for a different audience, which is really exciting for me. And then I'm learning some things and I'm covering stories that I had no idea about, right? I had no idea about the Marathon des Sables, the ultra marathon through the Sahara, and just the history of ultra marathons in general. We've got an episode coming up ahead of Christmas on reindeer racing, and I didn't know very much about that going into the production of that episode. So this has been really exciting, and I hope that you've been enjoying learning as I am learning alongside you, and as I hopefully bring some of my expertise to the things I have already covered, and that people in my circles, at least in sports, continue to talk about and have been talking about since we've been sports fans. If you're interested in going back and listening to some of our episodes that we've already put out, our second episode on the history of why we sing the national anthem at sporting events, I think was a really good one. The notion of singing the anthem at sporting events, at least in America, has become a really political idea and a conversation. But the history of why we do that, or at least answering the question of why we do that, isn't political at all. It's history. And one of the things that I hope that you get from this podcast is how much of our history we can learn from, how much our history, even in something like sports, informs where we are today, and how much our history, either fortunately or unfortunately, sometimes does repeat itself. So I'd encourage everyone to go back and listen to that episode. And then just some of the conversations that we've had. I've loved having some of my closest friends and colleagues on here. Aforementioned Jessica Luther had a fantastic conversation with Dr. Nefertiti Walker, who is just one of the smartest sports minds, professors, academics when it comes to sports and culture and society. And she's written this fantastic book with Dave Barry about the economics. It's called Slaying the Trolls, and it's answering all of the kind of usual talking points that the trolls who hate women's sports, they don't have a leg to stand on anymore. And I think that, for the next year, I'm just really excited to see where some of these conversations keep going. I hope that we continue to scrutinize sports in the same way that we have. I understand that we all need an escape from politics and from the world and from everything, and myself included, absolutely. But sports are intrinsically linked with all of those things, and I think it's a little impossible to get away from them. At the same time, we've got things like reindeer racing, so how bad can the world be? Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sportly. Don't miss next week's festive special where, as I said, we will dive into the world of reindeer racing, and you won't want to miss that, just in time for the holidays and for Christmas. Thanks so much for listening to Sportly. Sportly is an Immigrantly media production. This episode was produced by Sadia Khan and Shay Yu. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week for more Sportly.